Don't. Her voice broke on that single word, but she didn't move away. Jessie's hand was against her face, and Abigail Mercer, the pastor's widow, the town's untouchable symbol of faithful grief, was standing in a dark church with a man she had spent 6 weeks pretending not to want. And every reason she'd rehearsed for why this was wrong had gone completely silent. Her husband was buried 50 yards away. The congregation trusted her. God was supposedly watching. And none of it, not one word of it, was louder than the fact that she was leaning into his hand instead of pulling back. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button and stay with me all the way to the end of this story. Because what happens to Abigail Mercer is going to stay with you long after it's over. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. The town of Silver Hollow, Montana, had a way of deciding who a person was and then holding them to it forever. It wasn't cruel about it. That was the thing that made it so suffocating. The cruelty wore the face of reverence. The town loved Abigail Mercer, deeply, publicly, and completely on its own terms. They loved her the way people love a stained glass window, beautiful to look at, fragile enough to worry about, and most useful when the light was passing through her rather than coming from her. She was 32 years old. She had dark hair she wore pinned back so tight it pulled at her temples. She had green eyes that her husband Thomas had once called the color of spring fighting through frost. She had hands that were rougher than most people assumed because she'd grown up working her father's land before she became a pastor's wife, and she'd never fully shed the habit of usefulness. She cooked. She cleaned. She organized the church records. She visited the sick. She sat with the grieving. She did everything a pastor's widow was supposed to do, and she felt nothing while doing any of it. That was the secret she kept better than any other. Not that she missed Thomas, she did genuinely and quietly the way you miss a thing that was good and familiar and gone too soon. But grief had never been her loudest feeling. What lived loudest in her chest in the year since she'd buried him in the frozen January ground was something closer to suffocation. She had become, without anyone asking, Silver Hollow's permanent symbol of faithful endurance. And symbols aren't allowed to want things. Thomas Mercer had died in the 3rd week of January 14 months ago during the winter illness that had swept through Silver Hollow and taken 6 souls before the cold finally broke. He had been 41. He had been kind. He had been steady and good, and entirely devoted to his congregation in a way that sometimes left Abigail feeling like the 3rd priority in her own marriage after God and his flock in that order. She had never said that aloud, not once. Not even to herself really, until he was gone, and the silence of the parsonage had grown so complete that her own thoughts had no competition anymore. The morning after his burial, Deacon Harold Fitch had appeared at her door with a covered dish and an expression that managed to be both deeply sympathetic and immediately instructional. "The congregation is going to lean on you now, Abigail," he'd said, setting the dish on her kitchen table as if he owned the room. "You understand that, don't you? You're the keeper of Thomas's legacy here. That means something." "I just buried my husband yesterday," she'd said. "I know, and the Lord will see you through it. He always does for the faithful." A pause. "We're going to need you at Sunday service. The congregation needs to see you, needs to know you're steady." She had gone to Sunday service. She had sat in the front pew. She had been steady. She had done it every Sunday for 14 months after that. Not because faith commanded it, but because she didn't know yet that she had a choice. Jessie Cole arrived in Silver Hollow on a Tuesday morning in late March when the mud was still thick from the last melt and the wind still had teeth in it despite the season turning. Abigail didn't see him arrive. She heard about it from Martha Greer at the dry goods store, Martha who cataloged every newcomer to town with the thoroughness of a census taker and the enthusiasm of a gossip columnist, which she essentially was. "Cowboy type," Martha said, wrapping Abigail's flower order without slowing her narrative. "Came in on the morning stage, big. Not rough-looking exactly, but not soft either. Didn't have much luggage. Asked Ed Calloway about fence work out at the Harmon Ranch. Ed said he had the look of a man who knew what he was doing but didn't want to talk about where he'd been doing it. Is that unusual? Abigail asked, mostly to be polite. In my experience, men who don't want to talk about where they've been are either running from something or recovering from it. Martha said sagely. Time will tell which. Abigail took her flower and walked home, and thought nothing more about it. That lasted approximately 4 days. Key. The first time she actually saw him was at the edge of the churchyard on a Friday afternoon. He was working the fence line along the property Thomas had always meant to have it repaired and never gotten around to it, and the church council had apparently hired the newcomer to handle the job without consulting Abigail, which was typical of the way the church council operated regarding anything that touched her life. She was walking back from visiting old Mrs. Harlan, who was bedridden with a bad hip, and she came around the corner of the churchyard path to find him crouched over a broken post, working with the focused quiet of a man who'd done this work 10,000 times. He looked up when he heard her footsteps, and that was the moment she understood what Martha had meant. He wasn't rough, he wasn't soft. He was something in between, weathered like timber that had been through hard seasons and come out the other side with its grain tighter and stronger for it. His eyes were dark, and they were calm in a way that had nothing to do with peace and everything to do with practice. Like a man who'd learned to hold himself still because stillness was the only thing that had kept him from breaking. He nodded once, said nothing. She nodded back, kept walking. But she felt his eyes follow her to the gate, and she didn't let herself look back, and she hated the fact that not looking back required any effort at all. Dodd. His name spread through Silver Hollow the way all names did by osmosis through a dozen conversations she wasn't part of. Jesse Cole, from Wyoming, someone said. No, Colorado, someone else corrected. Worked cattle most of his life. Good with horses, better with fences, best left alone according to his own preference. He didn't come to church. That alone was enough to make certain members of the congregation treat him with the particular chill reserved for the spiritually unaffiliated. Deacon Fitch mentioned it within earshot of Abigail on Sunday, his voice carrying the tone of mild but pointed disapproval. A man who doesn't worship with his neighbors is a man who doesn't fully belong to them. Abigail had spent 14 months biting back things she wanted to say to Harold Fitch. She bit this one back too. But she thought without quite meaning to. Or he's a man who worships differently, or doesn't worship at all, or is carrying something too heavy to bring inside a church. She didn't know why she thought that. She didn't know why she was thinking about him at all. She went home and made supper and read 3 chapters of Proverbs and went to bed. She didn't sleep for a long time. The second time she really noticed Jesse Cole, she was at the orphan school. Silver Hollow's school doubled as both a regular classroom and a home for the 4 children currently, without families ranging from 7-year-old Clara, who'd lost her parents to a wagon accident 2 years back, to 14-year-old Pete, who'd been working odd jobs around town since he was 12, and had a look in his eyes that was older than his face by about a decade. Abigail volunteered there 3 mornings a week. It was the one part of her Silver Hollow life that felt genuinely hers, not performed. The children didn't need her to be a symbol. They needed her to show up and be present, and that she could still do. She arrived on Wednesday morning to find Jesse Cole on the roof. He was replacing shingles, alone without anyone having asked him to, as best she could determine. When she stopped below and looked up, shielding her eyes against the pale morning sun, he glanced down briefly. Leaking in the back corner, he said. Noticed it last week. Figured it was better to fix it before the spring rains really hit. Did someone hire you to do that? She asked. No. Did you ask permission? A pause. Should I have? She considered the question more seriously than he'd probably intended her to. No, she said finally. The roof needed fixing. Thank you. He nodded and went back to work. She stood there a moment longer than she needed to. Then she went inside. Inside, young Clara ran to her immediately and grabbed both her hands. Miss Abigail, the man on the roof, said good morning to me. He said I had good manners. Did you say good morning back? I said good morning and asked his name, and he said Jesse, and I asked if he was staying, and he said he didn't know yet. Clara, she said gently, it's not polite to ask a stranger if they're staying. Clara's face fell slightly. Is it rude? It's just some people don't know their own answers yet. She hadn't meant anything profound by it, but Clara nodded with the grave seriousness of a child absorbing important wisdom, and Abigail caught herself thinking the same sentence again. Some people don't know their own answers yet, and feeling it land somewhere it hadn't been aimed. The third encounter was the one that unsettled her. It was a Thursday early evening just before the light went gold and flat across the fields. She was carrying firewood in from the stack behind the parsonage. She did it herself. Had always done it herself. Found a certain satisfaction in the physical weight of honest work when she rounded the corner and nearly walked directly into Jesse Cole, who was apparently in the process of splitting additional wood for the stack. Without being asked, she stopped. He stopped. They regarded each other with the mutual startlement of two people who'd both been moving with the assumption of solitude. She started. Mrs. Harlan mentioned you didn't have much wood laid in, he said. Not apologetically, just as a fact explaining his presence. I was already splitting for the Caldwell place down the road. Figured I'd bring an extra load your way. Something in her chest tightened. Not unpleasantly. That was the problem. It wasn't unpleasant at all. And it absolutely should have been, because a strange man had come into her yard without invitation and was doing a thing that no one had asked him to do, and she should have felt invaded, or at minimum mildly annoyed. And instead she felt, "You don't have to do that," she said. "I know." He stacked the last of the split wood against the side of the house, unhurried. "Didn't figure I had to." "Then why?" He straightened and looked at her with those careful, quiet eyes. "Because it needed doing. Because you're doing it alone. And because neither of those facts seems right to me." The silence that fell was 5 seconds long and felt like a full season. "I've been doing things alone for 14 months, she said. Her voice came out steadier than she'd expected. "I know. Doesn't mean you have to keep doing it alone." And then he picked up his axe, nodded once, and walked back down the path toward the road without another word, as if he hadn't just said something that was going to keep her awake until well past midnight. She stood in her yard until the cold drove her inside. She told herself it was nothing. The way he looked at her. The way he kept showing up adjacent to places where she was struggling without making a production of it. The way he never not once called her the pastor's widow, or spoke to her with that particular mixture of reverence and pity that the rest of Silver Hollow had perfected. He just looked at her like she was a person. Like she was a person who was carrying something heavy and managing it, and was maybe, just maybe, capable of setting it down. She told herself it was nothing. She told herself this every day for 2 weeks with the dutiful persistence of a woman who understood that certain thoughts were territory she wasn't permitted to enter. She was Thomas Mercer's widow. She was the congregation's symbol. She was 32 years old, and she had years of quiet service ahead of her, and the appropriate feelings to cultivate were gratitude and faith, and the muted, dignified sorrow of a woman who had loved and lost and accepted the shape of her remaining life. Desire was not on that list. She knew this. She believed this. And then Deacon Harold Fitch came to her door on a Tuesday morning and said the thing that started the unraveling. The council has been discussing the question of permanent leadership," Fitch said, sitting in her kitchen with his hands folded around a cup of her tea, speaking in the careful tone of a man delivering news he'd already decided she would accept. "We've reached out to the Missoula Diocese. There's a young pastor there, married, solid family, sound theology, who's willing to relocate." "That's good," Abigail said. "The congregation needs consistent pastoral care. It is good." A pause. "We'll be needing the parsonage, of course, for the new pastor and his family." She set her own cup down. "I see. We've spoken with the Caldwells. They have a room available, very modest but suitable for..." "For what, Harold?" Her voice didn't rise. It went very level, which she'd learned was more effective anyway. "Suitable for what exactly?" Fitch shifted slightly. For a woman in your position. And what position is that? Abigail. He deployed her name with the practiced patience of a man managing a difficult but necessary conversation. You've been a tremendous source of strength for this congregation. Thomas would be proud. But the practical reality is that the parsonage is church property and I've been living here because the church asked me to remain as a presence of continuity, she said. That's what you told me 14 months ago, that the congregation needed to see me here, that it would comfort them. It has. It has comforted them greatly. And now it's inconvenient. Now it's time for a new chapter, he said, for all of us. She looked at him across her kitchen table. The kitchen table she'd scrubbed and set and served meals at for 6 years, and she felt something she hadn't felt in over a year. Not grief, not loneliness, anger. Clean, clear, clarifying anger. She did not show it. She thanked him for coming. She said she would think about the room at the Caldwells. She walked him to the door and closed it behind him with perfect composure. Then she stood in the middle of her kitchen and breathed, a decoration of grief. That was what she was to them. That was what she'd allowed herself to become a piece of the church's emotional furniture, useful until something newer and more functional came along, at which point she could be relocated to a modest room and continue to perform her quiet suffering in a smaller space. She stood there for a long time. Outside her window she could hear the sound of someone working. She didn't have to look to know who it was. She'd grown attuned to the particular rhythm of his work over the past weeks in a way she hadn't admitted to herself until right now. She walked to the window. Jesse Cole was repairing the gate latch on the churchyard fence, moving with the unhurried competence that she'd come to recognize as his particular signature. Not slow, not fast, just thoroughly present in what he was doing. He didn't look up. She watched him for 30 seconds, maybe 40. Then she turned away from the window and thought, I don't know what comes next. And for the first time in 14 months that felt less like terror and more like a door she hadn't noticed was there. That evening she went back through every prayer she'd prayed in the past year. Not the ones she'd said in public, those were polished things shaped for congregation ears full of the correct sentiments arranged in the correct order. She went back through the private ones. The ones she'd said alone in this house in the dark when the silence was loud enough to hurt. And she realized something that stopped her cold in the middle of her own bedroom floor. She hadn't prayed for herself. Not once. Not really. She'd prayed for Thomas's memory to be honored. She'd prayed for the congregation to find comfort. She'd prayed for the sick, the grieving, the struggling families on the edge of the county. She'd prayed for rain when the fields needed it, and patience when the deacon board tested it. She had not once in 14 months said, "What about me?" She sat down on the edge of the bed. "What about me?" she said aloud to the empty room, to the God she was no longer sure was listening in the way she'd been taught, but who she was addressing anyway out of the sheer habit of having no one else to speak honestly to. The room stayed quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the eaves. And somewhere down the road, in the small boarding room above the hardware store where Jesse Cole had apparently taken up temporary residence, a lamp was probably still burning. She was not thinking about that lamp. She absolutely was thinking about that lamp. She lay back on the bed fully dressed and stared at the ceiling. This is wrong, she thought. Then she thought, is it? Then she thought, don't. Then she thought of what he'd said in her yard. Because neither of those facts seems right to me, and the way he'd said it. Not as an invitation, not as a move, just as a man stating what he saw plainly without apology or agenda. She thought of the way no one else in Silver Hollow had looked at her like she was still a person first. And she thought, I am so tired. Not tired like sleep-deprived. Tired the way a river gets when it's been dammed for too long, all that water with nowhere to go. Pressure building against walls that weren't built to hold forever. She was 32 years old. She had spent 14 months being a symbol. She had spent 6 years before that being a pastor's wife, which had its own set of invisible requirements. And somewhere in there, buried under all of it, was a woman who had dreams and hungers, and a laugh she hadn't used in so long she'd half forgotten the sound of it. The lamp down the road burned on. Abigail Mercer closed her eyes, and for the first time in 14 months, she did not pray for anyone else's peace. She just breathed. And in the breathing, something small and stubborn and entirely her own refused quietly, definitely without fanfare, to stay buried. She didn't know yet that the storm coming in from the north that weekend would trap her inside an empty church with a man she was trying very hard not to think about. She didn't know yet what she would say, or what he would say back. But she was already, whether she admitted it or not, no longer the same woman who had sat in the front pew 14 months ago and decided that surviving was the same as living. She wasn't, not yet. But the distance between who she'd been and who she might become had, in the space of a single evening, gotten very small. The storm came in faster than anyone predicted. By Saturday afternoon, the sky over Silver Hollow had turned the particular shade of gray-green that old-timers recognized and respected, not just rain coming, but the kind of weather that had opinions about where you'd be spending the next few hours. Abigail had been at the orphan school when the first serious gusts hit, helping Clara with her letters, while Pete sat in the back corner pretending he wasn't also listening to the lesson because he was 14 and had a reputation to protect. She should have left earlier. She knew that. But Clara had been struggling with her R's, curling them wrong no matter how many times Abigail demonstrated, and there was something about a child's determined frustration that made it nearly impossible for Abigail to walk out the door. So she'd stayed, and by the time she finally stepped outside, the full weight of the storm was already moving in from the north, and the road back to the parsonage had become a conversation between wind and mud that she was losing badly. She made it halfway before she accepted the obvious. The abandoned church was closer. The old First Methodist had been empty for 3 years. The congregation had merged with the newer chapel on the east side of town, after a disagreement about property taxes and pastoral authority that Abigail had been present for but had never fully understood. The building still stood locked, still belonging technically to a church board that couldn't agree on what to do with it. But Thomas had kept a spare key for emergencies. He'd been that kind of man, the kind who kept spare keys and extra candles and contingency plans, and Abigail still had it on her ring out of habit she'd never examined. She was through the door and pulling it shut behind her before she fully registered that she wasn't alone inside. Jesse Cole was standing at the far end of the main room, candle already lit in his hand, looking at her with an expression that said he was not entirely surprised to see her, and was not entirely sure what to do with that fact. "Storm caught you too," he said. "Storm caught me too." She pushed her wet hair back from her face. "How long have you been here?" 20 minutes maybe. Found the door open." She didn't ask which door or how. Some conversations weren't the point. She crossed the room and sat down on one of the old wooden pews, wringing water from her sleeve, and the silence between them settled in the way silences do when two people are acutely aware of each other, and choosing very carefully what to say first. Jessie set the candle on the windowsill and sat down 2 pews back from her, which was either consideration or caution, and she couldn't decide which. "You've been avoiding me," he said. Not an accusation, just a statement of observed fact in that direct way he had, that she was learning to recognize as simply how he communicated. No softening, no social cushioning. Just the plain thing, said plainly. "I've been busy," she said. Abigail. The way he said her name, not Mrs. Mercer, not the soft formal address everyone else used. Just her name said like it belonged to a person rather than a title did something to her composure that she was not prepared for. "I've been avoiding you," she admitted. "I figured." A pause. "Want to tell me why?" "Not particularly." "All right." That was another thing about him. He didn't push. He asked, and then accepted the answer, whatever the answer was, which was so contrary to her experience of the past 14 months. Everyone in Silver Hollow pushed. Everyone had an agenda for what she should feel and when and how, that it occasionally wrong-footed her. She turned to face him. "Why are you still in Silver Hollow?" "Because the work isn't finished. The fence work at the Harmon Ranch took 2 weeks. It's been 6. A beat of quiet. "I know. So the fence isn't why you're still here." He looked at her steadily. No, it's not. The candle flame bent sideways in a draft and steadied again. Outside, the rain was hitting the roof in earnest, now a full percussion section that made the silence inside feel louder rather than softer by contrast. "That's not a simple thing you just said," she told him. "No, it's not." "Jesse?" She heard the edge in her own voice, not anger, something closer to frightened honesty. "I am Thomas Mercer's widow. I am the pastor's widow. This town has decided what that means, and they have decided what it requires of me, and I have been doing my level best to disappear," he said quietly. She stopped. "That's what you've been doing," he said. "Not grieving, not healing, disappearing, 1 degree at a time, until there's nothing left of Abigail, and all that's left is the widow." The words landed like something dropped from a height. Not violent, but felt throughout. "You don't know me well enough to say that," she said. "Maybe not. Tell me I'm wrong." She opened her mouth. She closed it. He waited. "I don't know how to do this," she said finally, and her voice came out smaller than she'd intended, stripped of its careful armor. "I don't know what I'm doing or what I want or who I'm supposed to be now, and I have been walking around for 14 months pretending that I do and that I am, and it is—" She stopped, steadied herself. "It is exhausting." Jesse said nothing for a moment. Then, "Yeah, I imagine it is. You can't just say things like that." "Like what?" Like the things you say, the way you look at me, the wood you split without being asked, and the roof you fixed, and the way you never once called me the widow." Her voice had found its edges again, but they weren't directed at him. They were directed at herself, at the feeling she was failing to contain. "You can't just keep doing all of that and expect me not to—" She stopped herself. He didn't fill the silence this time. He let it stand there between them, full and significant, and waited for her to decide what she wanted to do with it. "Expect you not to what?" he asked, gently. "Not to notice," she said. "Not to feel." She looked at the floor. "Not to want." She said the last word like she was confessing to something criminal. Like the word itself required courage to speak. Jesse was quiet for the long moment. When he spoke, his voice was lower than it had been. "What do you want, Abigail?" She looked up at him. "I want to stop being a symbol," she said. "I want to walk down the street without people looking at me like I'm a reminder of something. I want to sit in a room and feel like I'm living in it instead of performing in it." She paused. "I want—" She stopped, because the next thing was honest in a way she wasn't sure she was ready for. "Say it," he said. "I want someone to look at me like I'm still a person worth looking at." Her voice didn't break, but it wanted to. Not the widow, not the symbol, not Thomas's legacy. Me. Just me. The candle threw their shadows long against the wall. Jesse stood up from the pew. He walked to where she sat and stopped in front of her, and he looked at her exactly the way she'd described. Not with reverence, not with pity, with full attention, the kind that sees rather than regards, and she felt it move through her like the first warm day after a winter that had gone on too long. "I'm looking," he said quietly. She couldn't breathe properly. "Jesse, I'm not asking anything of you," he said. "I'm not asking you to forget Thomas or pretend you didn't love him or skip any part of what you need to get through. I'm not in a hurry. I'm not going to push." He crouched down so their eyes were level, and she didn't have to look up at him like she was receiving instruction from someone standing over her. "But I need you to know that I see you, not the widow, you. And what I see is worth a great deal more than what this town has decided to do with you." The rain drove hard against the roof. Abigail realized her hands were shaking. Not from cold. "How do you do that?" she whispered. "Do what? Say exactly the thing that is—" She couldn't finish. "The thing that is what?" She looked at him. "The thing that is most dangerous to hear." Something shifted in his expression, not a smile exactly, but the possibility of one. "I've spent a lot of years not saying the right things. Figured I'd stop wasting time on the wrong ones. She almost laughed. She almost cried. She did neither. She said, "Who are you, Jesse Cole? Who actually are you? Because you show up in this town and fix things that aren't your responsibility, and say things that no one else has the nerve to say. And I don't know your history, and I don't know what you're carrying, and I don't know." "Ask me," he said. "Whatever you want to know, ask me." She hadn't expected that. "All right." She gathered herself. "Why don't you come to church?" The brief warmth in his face shuddered. Not completely, but enough that she felt it. "That," he said, "is a long answer. We're not going anywhere for a while." He was quiet for a moment. Then he straightened and sat down on the pew beside her, close enough that she was aware of the precise amount of space between their arms, and he was quiet for long enough that she thought he'd changed his mind about answering. Then he said, "I had a daughter." The word "had" was doing enormous work in that sentence, and they both knew it. Abigail said nothing, waited. Her name was Rose. She was 4 years old. He said this like he was reading from something written inside his chest. She got sick. Fast, the way things do when they don't give you time to prepare. My wife Eleanor, she prayed constantly. Prayed harder than I'd ever seen anyone pray. Took Rose to every church in the county, had 3 different pastors lay hands on her. He paused. Rose died on a Sunday morning, in the middle of a prayer circle. Another pause. So I stopped going. Abigail felt the weight of this settle over her completely. Not the sentimental weight of a sad story. The real weight, the kind that comes from recognizing another person's particular private devastation. "Jesse," she said, "it's been 4 years. Eleanor and I, we didn't survive it. Not together." He was still looking straight ahead. "She went to her sister's place in Oregon. I went wherever the work was. Spent the better part of 3 years not looking for anything, which is a good way to make sure you don't find anything." A long breath. "Then I ended up here. And," he turned to look at her, "and I found something I wasn't looking for." The space between them felt suddenly acutely alive. "This isn't fair," she said softly. "To either of us." "No, it's not. I'm still the pastor's widow in this town. I still have. There are expectations, and the council and Harold Fitch, who already wants to move me to a room at the Caldwells, and—" "Harold Fitch," Jesse said, and something in his voice changed, "is a man who confused authority over an institution with authority over a person. There's a significant difference." She stared at him. "How do you know about the Caldwells?" "Martha Greer talks to everyone," he said, and this time the near smile was fully visible, and God help her, she felt it everywhere. "That woman," Abigail muttered, "she means well. She means everything loudly in public and calls it goodwill." Jesse laughed, actually laughed, and it was such a sudden, honest, unguarded sound in the middle of all this careful weight that Abigail felt something happen in her chest that she hadn't felt in so long she'd almost forgotten it had a name. Joy. Small and fragile and entirely unwelcome. But there. They sat in the sound of the rain for a while. Then Abigail said, "What do you want, Jesse, if I can ask?" "You can always ask. So tell me." He was quiet for a moment, but not evasive. Considering. "I want to stop moving," he said at last. "I've been moving for 4 years because stopping meant feeling everything I'd outrun. And I'm tired." He glanced at her. "You know something about tired." "I do. I want to wake up somewhere that feels like it's mine. I want to do work that adds up to something instead of just filling time. I want—" He stopped. And the pause was the same kind hers had been, the pause before the honest thing. "Say it," she said quietly, using his own words back. He looked at her directly. "I want to matter to someone again. Not as a worker. Not as a hired hand. As a person." He said the last part plainly without apology. "I want to matter to you, Abigail. I'm aware of every reason that's complicated. I'm not pretending it isn't." She was so still, she might have stopped breathing. "Jesse, you don't have to say anything back," he said quickly. "I'm not asking for an answer tonight. He exhaled. "You said you wanted someone to see you. I'm saying I see you. And I'm saying it cost me nothing to say it because it's the plainest truth I've told in 4 years. Outside, the storm made its presence known with a crack of thunder that shook the old boards of the building. And inside that sound, inside that trembling moment, Abigail Mercer made a decision that she hadn't fully planned, hadn't carefully reasoned through, hadn't prayed about, or consulted anyone concerning. She reached out and put her hand over his. Just that. His hand was rough and warm, and he went very still when she touched it, like a man who hadn't been touched gently in a very long time, and wasn't sure how to receive it. "I'm not ready," she said quietly. "I want to be honest with you the way you've been honest with me. I'm not ready for whatever this is. I'm still figuring out who I am when I'm not performing grief for an audience. I'm still—" She pressed lightly on his hand. "I still need time." "I know," he said, and meant it. "But—" She didn't move her hand. "I don't want you to stop seeing me." He turned his hand over slowly beneath hers, and his fingers closed around her hand carefully. "The way you hold something you're aware is both valuable and uncertain." "I won't," he said. They sat like that for a long time. The storm worked itself out above them, and eventually the rain slowed from furious to steady, to a quiet afterthought, and neither of them spoke much, and neither of them moved apart. It was the most honest Abigail had been in over a year. Maybe longer, and the most terrifying part was that it didn't feel wrong. It felt with devastating simplicity like finally. But Silver Hollow wasn't finished with her yet. When she walked back into town the following morning, dry clothes and composed expression carefully in place, Martha Greer was at the dry goods store, and the look on her face told Abigail everything she needed to know about how small a town really was, and how little a storm was required to set tongues moving. "People saw you go into the old church last night," Martha said without any preamble. "People saw me take shelter from a storm," Abigail said. "People saw you go in, and then people saw Jesse Cole go in." Martha's voice was not unkind, but it was precise. "And people are talking." "People are always talking, Martha." "Abigail." Martha set down what she was holding and looked at her directly woman to woman rather than neighbor to neighbor. "I'm not one of the ones talking against you. I want to be clear about that. But Harold Fitch has already been to see Reverend Morrison over at the new chapel, and there are words being said that—" "What words?" Martha's expression shifted, uncomfortable with the specifics, but too honest to withhold them. "Unseemly. That word has been used. And improper. And there was something said about whether you're fit to continue volunteering at the children's school." The cold that moved through Abigail had nothing to do with the morning temperature. "On the basis of taking shelter from a storm," she said. "On the basis of being seen with a man who isn't your husband and who doesn't attend church." Martha picked up what she'd set down. "I'm sorry. I thought you should know before you walked into Sunday service and found out the harder way." Abigail stood in the middle of the dry goods store and felt the town's invisible architecture close around her, all the expectations and assumptions and judgments built up over 14 months of careful performance, and underneath them, the much older architecture of what a woman in her position was and wasn't permitted to be. A decoration of grief. That was what Fitch had said essentially. Move to a modest room and continue performing your appropriate sorrow in a smaller space. She thought of Jesse's hand warm under hers. She thought of the word unseemly in Harold Fitch's mouth. She thought of Clara struggling with her R's of Pete, pretending not to listen, in the back corner of the children, who needed her to show up, regardless of whether it was convenient for the church council's sensibilities. She thought of herself at 32, standing at the beginning of what could be many years of living, being told that the appropriate way to spend them was smaller and quieter and more decorative and less real than any actual life should be. Something moved in her chest. Not anger this time. Anger she'd felt before and suppressed. This was something older and quieter and far more resolute. "Thank you, Martha," she said. Her voice was completely calm. "I appreciate you telling me." She walked out of the dry goods store. She didn't go to Harold Fitch's house, And she didn't go to Reverend Morrison's chapel, and she didn't sit in the parsonage and compose carefully worded reassurances about her behavior and her virtue and her continued commitment to the appropriate performance of grief. She went to the orphan school. Clara met her at the door. "Miss Abigail, are you okay?" "Pete said something happened and you look, I look like what?" Abigail asked, kneeling down to the child's level. Clara studied her face with a 7-year-old's unfiltered accuracy. "You look like you decided something." Abigail looked at this child, this small, clear-eyed, completely honest child, and felt something shift in her spine. Straighten. Settle. "I think I did," she said. "Let's work on your R's." She spent the entire morning at the school, and for the first time in 14 months, she did not think once about whether she was performing it correctly. She just taught. She just was. And somewhere across town, Harold Fitch was preparing his case, and Reverend Morrison was nodding along, and the word unseemly was making its way through Silver Hollow, like all small-town judgments do, quietly, persistently, and with absolute certainty of its own righteousness. They had no idea what was coming. Neither, honestly, did Abigail. But the woman sitting in that schoolroom watching Clara finally curve her R exactly right and break into a grin wide enough to light the room was already quietly, definitively, and without apology, not the same woman who had sat in the front pew and decided that surviving was enough. She was something the town hadn't accounted for. She was starting to wake up. The formal letter from the church council arrived at the parsonage on Thursday morning, slid under the door sometime before sunrise, which told Abigail everything she needed to know about the courage of the people who'd written it. She read it standing in the kitchen, still in her nightclothes, and she read it twice because the first time through, she was certain she'd misunderstood. She hadn't. The language was careful. Church language always was that particular blend of scripture and bureaucracy that managed to say something cruel in complete grammatical gentleness. But the meaning was plain enough. The council had convened an emergency session. There were concerns, the letter said, about the example being set by certain behaviors inconsistent with her station. There would be a meeting on Sunday afternoon following service, at which Abigail would be asked to speak to the matter. Attendance was not optional. She folded the letter with both hands. She set it on the kitchen table. She put the kettle on for coffee and stood at the window and watched the early morning light come across the fields, and she thought with absolute clarity that there was a version of herself, the version that had existed for 14 months, who would have spent the next 3 days preparing her defense, crafting apologies, smoothing every rough edge, walking into that Sunday meeting soft and small and appropriately sorry. She thought about that version of herself for a long time. Then she drank her coffee and got dressed and went to find Jessie Cole. She didn't examine the choice too carefully. Examining it would have given Doubt enough room to talk her out of it, and she'd given Doubt 14 months of uninterrupted floor time already. He was at the Harmon Ranch, which she knew because there was apparently no piece of information in Silver Hollow that Martha Greer didn't have organized and available. Jessie was working the far fence line, and when she came across the field toward him, not running, but moving with a purpose that didn't allow for second-guessing, he turned and watched her come and did not look surprised, which she was beginning to understand was simply how he received the world. "They sent a letter," she said when she was close enough that the wind wouldn't take the words. "I know." She stopped. "How do you know?" "Pete came and found me this morning. Said Miss Abigail got a letter under her door, and he'd heard about it from the Harlan boy, who heard it from someone at the council meeting." He set down the wire he'd been working. This town has a more efficient communication system than most telegraph offices. Despite everything, she almost smiled. "Are you aware of what they're accusing me of?" "Unseemly conduct," he said. The words in his mouth were flat with contempt, not for her, but for the phrase itself. "Behavior inconsistent with your station." "Yes." "Because you were in the same building as me during a storm." "Because I was in the same building as a man who doesn't attend church," she corrected. "That's the actual charge if we're being precise." Jessie looked at her steadily. "Abigail, this is my fault. I should have—" "Don't," she said. "Don't apologize for the storm. Don't apologize for being there. Don't you dare apologize for any of it." He stopped. What I need, she said, is to know something. And I need you to answer me honestly, even if you think the honest answer is going to make things harder. Ask. Are you planning to stay in Silver Hollow? The question landed between them with real weight. Because they both understood it wasn't logistical. It was the question underneath all the other questions. It was the one that made every other calculation matter or not matter. Jesse took a breath. Yeah, he said. I am. Why? You know why. I need to hear you say it. He looked at her for a long moment. Because there's something here worth staying for. Because I haven't felt that in 4 years, and I'm not interested in walking away from it. He held her gaze. Because you're worth more than this town knows how to value, and I would very much like to be in the vicinity when you figure that out yourself. Abigail felt that in her chest so completely that she had to look away for a moment. At the fields, at the sky, at anything that wasn't his face, because his face was doing something to her composure that she couldn't entirely manage at this particular moment. Then I'm going to that meeting Sunday, she said, and I'm going to say what I actually think. That sounds like it might be significant, he said carefully. It might burn everything down, she agreed. But I've been living in a building I didn't choose for 14 months, and I think I'm ready to walk out of it. He was quiet for a moment. Then, what do you need from me? No, are you sure? No, be careful. No, have you thought this through? Just, what do you need? She breathed. Nothing yet. Just know that I'm not avoiding you. Whatever happens Sunday, whatever comes next, I am not running from you. Okay, he said simply. Okay, she repeated. And she turned and walked back across the field, and neither of them said anything more because sometimes the most important things have already been said, and more words would only crowd them. The 3 days before Sunday moved strangely simultaneously, crawling and rushing, the way time does when something significant is approaching, and your body knows it, even when your mind is trying to stay practical. Abigail taught at the school. She visited Mrs. Harlan. She cooked and cleaned and moved through the routines of her days with the surface composure of a woman handling things, and underneath that surface something was running fast and clear and certain, building toward Sunday, the way a river builds toward a falls. Deacon Fitch came to the parsonage on Saturday afternoon. He knocked, which was more than the letter had managed, and she let him in because refusing him entry would have been a confrontation. She wasn't ready to have the day before the actual confrontation. He sat across from her at the kitchen table and folded his hands and looked at her with the expression she'd come to think of as his pastoral concern face concern, genuinely felt she believed, but concern that had somehow appointed itself the judge of its own conclusions. I want this to go smoothly tomorrow, he said. I think it can if we're all reasonable. Define reasonable, she said. A simple acknowledgement of the appearance of impropriety. An agreement to be more mindful of situations that could be misread. A step back from the connection, whatever it is, with the coal man. He spread his hand slightly. That's all. Then everything returns to normal. Everything returns to normal, she repeated. Yes. Harold. She folded her own hands on the table in a deliberate echo of his posture. What is normal in this context? Walk me through it. He shifted slightly. You know what I mean. I want to hear you say it. Abigail. Say it. He exhaled. You maintain your position in this community as Thomas's widow, as a woman of faith and standing, who conducts herself in a way that honors his memory and serves as an example. For how long, she asked. I'm sorry. For how long do I maintain this position? A year? 5 years? 10 until I die and get buried beside him, and the town can have 2 graves to point to as symbols of faithful endurance. Her voice was still level, still even. Is there a timeline, Harold? Because no one ever mentioned one to me. They said for now, and while you're grieving and the congregation needs you, and none of those things have a fixed ending. Fitch's expression had moved from concern to something more cautious. That's not a fair characterization, isn't it? She leaned forward slightly. You moved me into this parsonage because the congregation needed continuity. You relied on my presence at every service, every gathering, every moment of community need for over a year. And now you're moving a new pastor in and moving me to a room at the Caldwells. And when I step outside for an evening and have an honest conversation with a decent man who treats me like a human being rather than a monument, you call it unseemly. You call it improper." She paused. "Help me understand, Harold. What precisely am I allowed to be?" The silence in the kitchen was very loud. Fitch looked at her with the expression of a man encountering a version of Abigail Mercer that he had not anticipated and was not certain how to navigate. "I think," he said slowly, "that grief can sometimes make people—" "Don't say confused," she said quietly. He stopped. "Don't say grief makes people confused. Don't tell me what grief does. I have been the most functional person in this congregation for 14 months. I have shown up to everything. I have failed no one. I have given everything this town asked of me, and I have asked for nothing back." She stood. "I'll be at the meeting tomorrow, and I will have things to say." Fitch stood too, somewhat hastily. "Abigail, I only want what's best." "I know you do," she said. "That's almost the worst part. I'll see you tomorrow." She walked him to the door and closed it behind him. Then she stood in the middle of her kitchen and realized she wasn't shaking. She'd expected to be shaking. Every confrontation in the past 14 months had left her shaking afterward. Hands voiced the physical aftermath of held-in emotion, finally releasing somewhere private. But her hands were steady. Her breathing was even. She felt, in fact, more settled than she had in over a year. She went to bed early, slept better than she had in months. Sunday morning service was purgatory in slow motion. She sat in the front pew, as she always had, and the congregation watched her with the particular intensity of people who knew something was coming and were positioned for the best view. Some of the looks were sympathetic. Martha Greer caught her eye from 3 rows back and gave her a small firm nod. Some were curious. Some were the careful neutrality of people who hadn't decided yet what side they were on. Harold Fitch preached about the virtue of community accountability. He didn't look at her once during the sermon. She sang every hymn. When service ended and people filed into the fellowship hall for the council meeting, Abigail walked in last. Jesse was not there. She hadn't expected him to be, and this wasn't his battle to stand in front of. But she knew with a certainty she couldn't have explained that he knew what was happening and was somewhere nearby and would be there when it was over. The council sat at a long table at the front of the room. 7 men. Harold Fitch in the center, as was his custom. 3 women from the Ladies' Aid Society sat along the wall, not at the table, which said its own quiet thing about the architecture of authority in this room. Reverend Morrison, the young pastor from the East Chapel, the one being considered to replace Thomas, sat at the end of the table. He was perhaps 30 years old. He had the clean, certain face of a man who had not yet been tested by anything that exceeded his theology. Fitch began with a prayer, which felt like putting his thumb on the scales, but she let it pass. Then he laid out the situation in the language of the letter with additions. There had been concerns. There had been observations. There had been a pattern some felt of behavior that risked the dignity and reputation of the memory of Reverend Thomas Mercer. He said Thomas's name 3 times in the opening remarks. She counted. "We'd like to hear from you, Abigail," he said finally. "In your own words." She stood. She looked at the room, at the council, at the women along the wall, at the gathered congregation members who'd stayed for the meeting because Silver Hollow didn't have many forms of theater, and this was better than most. She thought of Jesse saying, "You've been dead long enough." She thought of Clara finally getting her R's right. She thought of the letter slid under her door in the dark. She thought of 14 months. "I'm not going to apologize," she said. The room stilled. "I know that's what you're expecting. A statement of regret, an acknowledgement of appearances, a promise to behave more appropriately." She paused. "I'm not going to do that, because I have spent 14 months behaving in exactly the way this congregation required of me, and I have done it faithfully and without complaint, and I have received in return." She looked at Fitch. "A letter under my door in the dark, a room at the Caldwells, and a meeting to discuss whether I'm still a suitable symbol. Fitch started to speak. "I'm not finished," she said. He stopped. "I was in a church during a storm. I spoke with a man who has in 6 weeks shown me more basic human decency than most of this room has managed in 14 months. He has never disrespected me. He has never disrespected Thomas's memory. He fixed the roof of the children's school without being asked and has given more practical charity to people in need in this town than most people who sit in this congregation on Sunday." Her voice was steady. She was not performing. This was just the truth, said without decoration. "If that is unseemly, then I am proud to be unseemly." Complete silence. Then a sound she didn't expect. From the women's section along the wall, quiet at first, then gaining presence, someone began to clap. Martha Greer. Then the woman beside her. Then 2 more. Fitch's expression went through several phases rapidly. This is not a performance." "No," Abigail said. "It isn't. A performance is what I've been doing for 14 months. This is the first honest thing I've said in this building since Thomas died." Reverend Morrison, who had been a silent observer until now, cleared his throat and spoke for the first time. "Mrs. Mercer," he said carefully, "I want to be sensitive to, with respect." Abigail said, turning to look at him directly, "You have been in Silver Hollow for 6 days. You don't know me. You don't know what this past year has required of me or what it has cost. I don't hold that against you, but I'd ask that you listen before you counsel." Morrison blinked, said nothing more. Fitch's face had gone from cautious to something that looked alarmingly like embarrassment, which she recognized was probably the most dangerous she'd made him today. Embarrassed men with authority were unpredictable. "Abigail," he said, his voice lower now. The public register dropped for something more private, and therefore more coercive. "You are making a serious mistake in front of this entire congregation. If you'll just step back from the emotion of the moment, Harold." She looked at him without heat and without performance. "I love you like the difficult uncle you've always been to this congregation. And I am telling you as clearly as I know how, I am not your symbol. I was not born to be one, I did not agree to be one, and I am done being one." A pause. "I am going to live my life. I am going to feel what I feel, and pursue what I believe is right, and determine for myself what honors Thomas's memory, not because I owe this congregation that explanation, but because it's true." She looked around the room one more time. "I hope you can find it in yourselves to let a woman be a person. I genuinely do." She picked up her coat from the back of her chair. She walked out. Not dramatically, not with a door slam. Just walked out through the fellowship hall, through the back entrance into the cool afternoon air and the open sky. Her hands were shaking now. There it was, the body catching up with the courage. She was standing at the edge of the churchyard, breathing carefully when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned, expecting Martha or one of the women from the meeting. It was Jesse. He was standing 10 feet away, and he'd clearly come quickly because there was something in his posture that said he'd been waiting close by without crowding her. He didn't say anything, just looked at her with those dark, careful eyes and waited for her to tell him what she needed. "You heard," she said. "Pete told me you were in there saying things that needed to be said." He walked closer slowly. "You okay?" "I'm terrified," she said honestly. "My hands won't stop." "That's not fear," he said. "That's your body processing the fact that you just changed something." She looked at him. "I said I wasn't their symbol anymore." "Good. I said you'd shown more decency to this town than half the people sitting in the pews." Something moved in his face. "You didn't need to do that." "I know. I did it because it was true, and the truth has been in very short supply in this room for a long time." She exhaled slowly. "What happens now?" "Now you figure out what you want," he said. "Not what the council wants, not what Thomas's memory requires, what you want. What comes next for Abigail?" She was standing very close to him. close enough that she'd crossed some invisible boundary she'd been maintaining carefully since the night of the storm, without consciously deciding to cross it. "I want to stop being afraid of this," she said quietly. "Of what specifically?" he asked, and his voice was careful now. Careful the way a man is when he knows exactly what's happening and is giving the other person every chance to be sure. "Of you," she said. "Of wanting something that doesn't fit the story they've written for me." "Abigail, I know it's complicated," she said quickly. "I know there's 100 reasons to be careful, and 100 more to wait and think and pray about it, and I am not a person who does things without thinking them through. But I have been thinking about nothing else for 6 weeks, and I am so tired of thinking and not—" He touched her face. Just his hand against her cheek, gentle, deliberate asking, and every sentence she'd been building evaporated completely. She looked up at him, and Jesse Cole, who had spent 4 years moving through the world, like a man carrying something too heavy to set down, leaned forward and kissed her. Not urgently, not possessively. The way you reach for something you've been afraid to want carefully with full attention, grateful beyond expression just to be holding it. And Abigail Mercer, who had been the pastor's widow and a symbol of silence and a decoration of grief, kissed him back. For the first time in 14 months, she was not performing anything for anyone. She was just there, just herself, just alive. When they stepped apart, she was breathing differently, and his hand was still against her jaw, and they were looking at each other in the particular way of two people who have crossed a line and discovered with equal parts exhilaration and gravity that there's no reasonable path back. "This is going to make things complicated," she said quietly. "Yeah," he agreed. "The council will have opinions," he said. "They'll have a lot of opinions. Fitch is going to. Whatever he does, we'll handle it." He said "we" without any fanfare, just said it like it was already the truth. She felt that word rearrange something in her chest. "Jesse," she said, "there's something I need to tell you." His expression shifted. Not worried exactly, alert. "All right. The new pastor Morrison, he's moving into the parsonage. I have until end of month." She watched his face. "I don't have a plan yet." "You don't need to have a plan yet. I'm 32 years old, and I've been a wife and then a widow, and I've never just been myself, making my own choices without anyone else's structure around them." She was saying this plainly, not as a complaint, but as information. "I don't entirely know who I am when no one's telling me who to be." Jesse looked at her for a long moment. "I know who you are," he said. "Tell me. You're the woman who stayed late at the school because a 7-year-old was struggling with her letters and couldn't leave until the child got it right. You're the woman who went into that meeting today and told the truth when the easy thing, the safe thing would have been to apologize and keep your head down. You're the woman who stacked her own firewood and visited the bedridden and sang every hymn and held an entire congregation together for over a year while carrying her own weight with no one to help carry it." He paused. "You're the woman who told me I'd done something decent when most of this town was treating me like a cautionary tale. That wasn't nothing, Abigail. That was you." She felt that from her sternum outward. "You're going to make this very difficult to be sensible about," she said. "I'm not trying to make it difficult," he said. "I know. That's why it is." Something behind his eyes shifted, and she recognized it because she'd felt the same shift in herself that moment when something you've been holding carefully starts to feel less like a burden and more like a beginning. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "Right now, today." She thought about the meeting inside, about Fitch's face, about the women clapping from the wall, about the room at the Caldwells and the end of month and everything uncertain ahead. "I want to take a walk," she said, without looking over my shoulder. He offered his arm, and Abigail Mercer took it. They walked down the road together in plain sight of anyone who cared to look, which in Silver Hollow was everyone, and she did not look over her shoulder once. It was the single most defiant thing she'd ever done, and it felt with her hand on his arm, and the spring air just turning warm like the first honest breath she'd taken in over a year. But the town wasn't done with them yet, and neither was the past. Because 3 days later, a woman arrived in Silver Hollow on the morning stage with dark eyes and a set jaw, and a name that Jesse had never spoken and Abigail had never heard. And everything that had just started would have to survive what came with her. Her name was Eleanor Cole, and she was 34 years old, and she was beautiful in the way that grief makes some women beautiful, stripped down to something essential, all the softness worn away, and replaced with something harder and quieter and more true. Abigail didn't know any of that yet when Martha Greer appeared at the schoolhouse door on Wednesday morning with the particular expression she reserved for information of the highest grade. Abigail was mid-lesson Clara on her left, Pete pretending to read in the back, and she knew from Martha's face alone that whatever was coming had weight to it. "There's a woman at the boarding house," Martha said without preamble because Martha had never believed in preamble. "Arrived this morning, asked specifically for Jessie Cole's room number, gave her name as Eleanor Cole." A pause waited with implication. "Same last name." Abigail set down her chalk. "Thank you, Martha," she said. "Abigail." "I heard you." "Thank you." Martha left. Clara looked up at Abigail with those clear 7-year-old eyes that missed nothing. "Are you okay, Miss Abigail?" "Yes," she said. And because she couldn't lie to a child with a face like Clara's, she added, "I'm going to take a short break. Pete, you're in charge of reading until I'm back." Pete looked up from his book with an expression that said he was deeply opposed to responsibility, but would accept it. "How long?" "Not long." She walked out. She didn't go to the boarding house. She wasn't ready for that yet, and she knew herself well enough to know that walking into a situation before she understood it was how people said things they couldn't take back. Instead, she walked to the fence line at the edge of the Harmon property where Jessie had been working since early morning, and she let the walk burn through the first wave of whatever she was feeling. Not jealousy, she told herself, or not only jealousy, but something more complicated, more textured. Something adjacent to fear. He saw her coming from 50 yards out. She could tell by the way his posture changed, not tensed exactly, but readied. Like a man who already knows what news is walking toward him. She stopped in front of him. "Eleanor is here," she said. He set down his tools, said nothing. "You knew she was coming." "She sent a letter 2 weeks ago," he said. "Said she needed to talk. I didn't know exactly when." Abigail absorbed this. "You didn't tell me." "No." "Why not?" He looked at her directly. "Because I didn't want to complicate something that was just starting to feel possible. And because—" He stopped. "Because I was hoping I could handle it before it became your problem." "I'm not a problem to be managed around Jessie." "No, you're not. That was the wrong word." He ran a hand through his hair, the first gesture she'd ever seen from him that looked like something close to unsteady. "I'm sorry. That was wrong." She looked at him for a long moment. "What does she want?" "I don't know yet." "Guess." He was quiet. Then, "Eleanor and I ended badly. Not with anger, with silence, which is worse. We just stopped. After Rose, we stopped being able to reach each other. She left because staying hurt too much, and I let her leave because I thought she deserved better than what I had left to give." He paused. "I haven't spoken to her in over 3 years. And she comes now," Abigail said. "When you're here. When this—" She gestured, not quite finishing the sentence, not needing to. "Yes," he said. "Now." She breathed. "Are you going to see her?" "I have to." "I know you do." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not asking you not to. I'm asking Jessie. I am standing here having burned down 4 months of careful, safe, appropriate behavior in the space of one Sunday, and I need you to tell me something true right now. Ask, is there anything left between you and Eleanor that I should know about before this town watches you two have a conversation and draws its own conclusions?" He held her gaze without flinching. "She was my wife. She is the mother of my daughter who died. There will always be something between us because of that grief doesn't get divided on a timeline when it ends. His voice was steady and honest the way his voice always was. But what you're asking underneath that question, is there anything that threatens what's between you and me? The answer is no. There isn't. She held on to that. All right, she said. Abigail. Go see her, she said. I'll be at the school. She turned and walked back before he could say anything else because she'd said everything she needed to say, and staying longer would have moved her from brave into brittle, and she was not going to be brittle in front of him. Not today. She made it back to the school. She picked up the chalk. She finished the lesson. Her hands were completely steady, and she was deeply, quietly terrified, which she recognized as being basically the condition of her life at this point. Jessie found Eleanor at the boarding house dining room, which was empty at that hour, except for a woman who'd apparently been sitting there for 2 hours, with a cup of tea gone cold, and a look on her face that said she'd had a long time to decide what to say, and still wasn't certain she'd gotten it right. She looked up when he came in. 3 years was not a long time, and also, it was a lifetime. Jessie, she said. Eleanor. He sat down across from her and they regarded each other with the careful attention of two people who shared a profound history and were both aware that this conversation required something neither of them had found easy in a very long time. You look well, she said. You look tired, he said, not unkindly, just truthfully. She almost smiled. That's still how you are. Straight to the true thing. I find it saves time. Eleanor wrapped her hands around the cold tea. I heard about what you've been doing here. The fence work, the school roof, the widows with their firewood. She paused. I heard about the pastor's widow. What did you hear? That she stood up in a church meeting and said you were the most decent person in the county. A pause. And that you've been looking at her like she's the first real thing you've seen in years. Jessie said nothing. Is that true? Eleanor asked. Not with anger, with something closer to the careful honesty of a woman asking a question she genuinely needs answered. Yes, he said. She nodded slowly. Good. He looked at her. Eleanor, I didn't come here to take anything back, she said, and her voice was quiet and firm. I want you to know that first. I'm not here to stand between you and something good. I had my chance and we were both drowning, and neither of us knew how to save the other one, and I don't blame you for that, and I hope to God you don't blame me. I don't, he said. I need to hear that, she said. I need to hear you say you don't blame me for leaving. I don't blame you for leaving, he said. I never did. She exhaled. Something in her posture changed, some long-held tension releasing, and he recognized it because he'd been carrying a version of the same thing. I came because there are things I should have said 3 years ago, and I kept thinking they could wait, and they kept waiting and waiting, and now you're here in this town, starting something that looks like a life again, and I... Her voice caught once, just once. I needed to say them before you moved forward, because you deserve to move forward without carrying anything I left unfinished. He waited. I'm sorry, she said, for the way I left. Not for leaving, we both know that was the right thing, as brutal as it was, but for the way I did it, for the silence, for not saying goodbye properly, for leaving you with all of it, and going to my sister's, and letting years go by without... She stopped. Rose deserved better parents than we were to each other after she died. We were so broken we couldn't even grieve together. And I'm sorry for my part in that. Jessie was quiet for the long moment. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was necessary. I'm sorry too, he said finally. I shut down. After the funeral, I just shut down. And I know that put you alone inside a marriage that was supposed to hold you, and I wasn't able to hold anything. We were both underwater, she said. We were. Eleanor looked at him across the table. Are you happy here, or are you getting there? He thought about Abigail walking across a field to tell him the truth. He thought about Sunday afternoon and her hand on his arm and the fact that she hadn't looked over her shoulder once. Getting there, he said. Then get there, Eleanor said simply. Don't wait. Don't talk yourself out of it. Don't spend another 4 years being a cautious man when you've already survived the worst thing." She paused. "Rose would have liked you better happy. She always wanted you laughing." It was the first time either of them had said Rose's name out loud to each other in years. Jesse felt it move through him. Not the crushing grief of the early days, but something older and softer. Something that had, somewhere along the road to Silver Hollow, started to become memory rather than wound. "Yeah," he said quietly. She would have. Eleanor stood. "I'm heading back to Oregon on Friday's stage. I just needed to say the things." She looked at him with the eyes of a woman who had been through the same fire from a different angle. "Go find her, Jesse. Whatever she's worrying about right now, go find her." He stood. And for a moment they looked at each other not as husband and wife, not as two people at the end of a marriage, but as two people who had loved the same small girl and survived her loss and found their separate ways through. And he nodded once. She nodded back. And that was how 3 years of unfinished business got finished. It was barely noon. Across town, Abigail was doing something she hadn't done in over a year. She was in the parsonage, her parsonage still hers for another 2 weeks, and she was going through her own things with the purposeful energy of a woman who has decided that waiting is worse than moving. She was sorting, organizing, deciding what came next with her hands, because her mind was doing things she needed to outpace slightly. That was where Jesse found her. He knocked. She opened the door and read his face in approximately 3 seconds, the particular look of a man who has just set something down that he's been carrying a long time, and is surprised by how much lighter he feels. "How did it go?" she asked. "She came to apologize," he said, "and to tell me to stop waiting." Abigail leaned against the doorframe. "She told you to stop waiting." In more or less those words. And nothing," he said. "It's done. We said what needed saying. She goes back to Oregon Friday." He looked at her. "What are you doing?" "Packing," she said. "Already?" "I've been putting it off for 2 weeks because packing meant admitting the parsonage is ending, but I think—" She stepped back from the door so he could come in. "I think I've been waiting for things to feel safe enough before I move. And I'm starting to understand that the waiting is the problem." He walked in, looked at the boxes, the sorted piles, the room being systematically converted from inhabited to vacated. "Where are you going?" "I talked to the school board yesterday," she said. "They have a small house behind the schoolhouse that's been empty since the last teacher left. It needs work." She met his eyes. "But it's mine. Actually mine, not church property, not borrowed. Mine." Something in his expression shifted into something warm. "Abigail, I want to teach," she said. "Full-time. Not as a volunteer, as an actual teacher. The board said if I can demonstrate the children are progressing, they'll formally hire me in the fall." She was speaking faster than usual, the speed of someone announcing a decision before doubt can intercept it. "It's not much. The pay is modest. The house needs a new roof and possibly new—" "I can fix a roof," he said. She stopped. He was looking at her with the straightforward certainty of a man who has in the space of one morning resolved the last thing holding him in place and is now entirely available for what comes next. "Jesse," she said carefully, "I am still figuring out who I am outside of what this town decided I should be. I am 32 years old, and I am starting over in most of the ways a person can start over, and I don't know—" She stopped. "I don't know what shape this is going to take. Me and you. Whatever this is." "I know," he said. "I can't promise you I won't be a mess sometimes. I'm aware. I can't promise I'll be easy. I was a pastor's wife for 6 years, and I still have all of that inside me, the good parts, and the parts that were mostly performance, and I'm still sorting out which is which. Abigail." He crossed the room and stood in front of her and took both her hands the way he had in the old church the night of the storm, with the steadiness of a man who is not going anywhere. "I don't need you to be figured out. I need you to let me stay." She looked at him. "Let me stay," he said. "That's all I'm asking. Let me be here while you figure it out. Let me fix the roof and sit with you while you sort out what's performance and what's real, and be the person standing next to you when Silver Hollow decides whether it's going to accept who you're becoming or not." His voice was quiet and absolute. "That's all I want. Permission to stay." She felt the weight of the past 14 months, all the performed grief, the borrowed silence, the endless correct behavior. She felt it the way you feel something just before it lifts, right at the end of the heaviness. "You can stay," she said, and she meant it in every sense the words contained. He pulled her close and held her, and she let herself be held without calculating whether it was appropriate, without measuring it against the congregation's expectations, or Thomas's memory, or Harold Fitch's very detailed opinions about what her life should look like. She just stood there and let it be real. It lasted maybe 30 seconds before the knock came. She would later reflect that Harold Fitch had an almost supernatural talent for the worst possible timing. She stepped back. Jessie's expression shifted to something patient and mildly resigned. She went to the door. Fitch stood on her step. He had his hat in his hands, which was a new gesture. Harold Fitch did not usually hold his hat. He looked older today, or tireder, or possibly just less certain, which was the most unsettling of the three. He looked past her at Jessie, who was standing in the middle of her front room in plain sight, and something moved across his face that she couldn't fully read. "Abigail," he said, "may I speak with you alone, if—" "Jessie can hear whatever you have to say," she said. Fitch absorbed this. "Very well." He looked at her. "The council met again last night, in my absence." He paused. "Reverend Morrison has withdrawn his interest in the Silver Hollow position." She stared. "What?" He cited irreconcilable differences with the community's current dynamic. Fitch's voice was carefully neutral. Effectively, he decided he didn't want to come here. "Because of what happened Sunday," she said. "In part." Fitch turned his hat in his hands. "There is also the matter of the 3 women from the Ladies' Aid Society who have formally requested a review of the council's handling of your situation. Martha Greer drafted the letter." He said this as if Martha Greer had personally handed him something lit. "It has 7 additional signatures." The room was very quiet. "Harold," Abigail said slowly, "why are you telling me this in person? You could have sent another letter under the door." Fitch was quiet for a moment. And in that moment, she saw something she hadn't seen before in all their years of tense, careful navigation around each other. She saw him actually looking at her. Not at the symbol. Not at the widow. At her. "Because I owe you that much," he said finally. "And because—" He stopped, cleared his throat. "Thomas asked me before he died. In the last weeks when he knew. He asked me to look after you." Another pause. "I think I confused looking after you with managing you. And I think—" He said the next words like they were costing him something genuine. "I think Thomas would be disappointed in how I've handled that responsibility." The silence was profound. "That took courage to say," Jessie said from behind her, quietly, without any edge. Fitch looked at him. "The church will need leadership," he said. "The position is still open. The parsonage will remain available until that's resolved. There is no urgency regarding your departure, Abigail. I want to be clear about that." Abigail looked at Harold Fitch, this difficult, well-meaning, thoroughly infuriating man, who had spent 14 months trying to put her life into a shape he could manage, and she felt something unexpected. Compassion. Genuine, uncomplicated compassion. "Thank you, Harold," she said. "That matters." He nodded once, put his hat back on, looked at Jessie briefly, looked back at her, nodded again, and left. Abigail stood in the doorway watching him go, and she felt the very specific sensation of a chapter ending. Not with drama, not with a door slam, just a chapter quietly, definitively closing the way chapters do when all the things that needed saying have finally been said. She turned back to Jessie. He was watching her with an expression she'd come to recognize over these past weeks, that particular mix of steady and warm that she had no adequate word for, and had stopped trying to name because some things were better felt than labeled. "Well," she said. "Well, He agreed. The parsonage isn't urgent anymore. So it seems. The schoolhouse behind the schoolhouse still needs a roof. Still does, he said. She crossed the room toward him. I meant what I said earlier, about not knowing what shape this takes. I know. And you meant what you said, about staying. Every word. She stopped in front of him. Close. The same distance they'd been on Sunday, when she'd taken his arm and they'd walked down the road together in plain sight, and she hadn't looked back once. Then we figure it out, she said. Together. He looked at her with those dark, quiet eyes. Together, he said. And that word, simple, plain 2 syllables. Nothing extraordinary about it, in any other context, landed in Abigail Mercer's chest, like a key into a lock she hadn't known was there. She leaned up and kissed him. Not like she had on Sunday, that first kiss, still carrying traces of surprise and courage, and the particular electricity of something new. This one was quieter, more certain. The kiss of a woman who knows what she's choosing, and is choosing it on purpose. When she pulled back, she looked at him. I need to finish packing, she said. He smiled fully openly, the way she'd now seen twice, and intended to see many more times. I'll carry the boxes. You don't have to. I know, he said. I want to. She shook her head slowly, and this time she let herself laugh, a real laugh, the kind she'd half forgotten, and it filled the room completely and honestly and without apology. Silver Hollow was about to learn something. The pastor's widow was done. Abigail Mercer was just getting started. The roof of the schoolhouse took Jesse 3 days. Abigail knew this because she was inside teaching while he worked, and she could hear the rhythm of him above her, steady, unhurried, methodical. And the children thought nothing of it after the first hour, which told her something about the difference between how children and adults assign meaning to ordinary things. Clara simply said on the first morning, "Jesse's fixing the roof," and went back to her letters. Pete glanced up, once nodded with the deep approval of a boy who respected practical competence, and returned to his arithmetic. The town naturally had more complex feelings about it. She heard the talk the same way she always had through Martha, through the particular shift in how people greeted her on the road, through the way certain women at the general store either made eye contact or didn't. Silver Hollow was rearranging itself around the new version of Abigail Mercer, and the process was neither smooth nor quick, and she had decided firmly finally, without revisiting the decision, that she was not going to manage it for them. That was the change. Not the moving, not Jesse, not the Sunday meeting. The change was that she had stopped being responsible for the town's comfort with who she was. It was, she discovered, an enormous amount of weight to put down. On the 4th morning in the schoolhouse house, her house small and drafty and entirely hers, she woke up and lay in the quiet and took stock of herself the way she used to take stock of the parsonage kitchen, just accounting for what was actually there. She was 32, she was a teacher, she was a woman who had been widowed and had grieved and had been used as a symbol and had refused the role and was now slowly and imperfectly building something from the materials of her own actual life. She was also, she admitted to the ceiling, in love with Jesse Cole. She hadn't said it out loud yet. Neither had he. There was something mutually understood about the timing of that particular word, that it required saying when both people were fully ready to receive it, and they were close, but not quite there, which was fine. Some things were worth getting right. She got up, made coffee, looked out at the schoolyard. Jesse was already there. He wasn't working. The roof was done. He was talking to Pete, who was early for school, as he'd been every day since Abigail had moved in, arriving before the other children, with no stated reason, but an obvious one to anyone paying attention. Pete was 14 and had no family, and had been watching adults fail to commit to things his entire life, and Jesse showing up every day to fix something had made an impression that no one had asked him to make. She watched them through the window. Jesse said something. Pete laughed, a real laugh, not the careful, guarded version he usually offered. Jesse clapped him once on the shoulder, the way men do when words aren't the point, and Pete stood a little straighter. Abigail felt that somewhere she hadn't expected to feel it. She opened the door. "Coffee's on," she called. Jesse turned. That smile, the full one, the open one, the one she'd decided was her favorite thing in Silver Hollow, Montana. 5 minutes, he said. Pete looked at her with the carefully casual expression of a boy trying not to appear invested. Can I have some too? You can always have coffee, she said. You're practically faculty at this point. Pete's attempt not to look pleased failed completely. She went back inside. The morning classes went the way good mornings did, the work finding its rhythm. The children settling into the particular focus that came when they were genuinely engaged, which Abigail had learned was the only kind of teaching worth doing. Clara finally read a full sentence aloud, without stumbling, and the look on her face when she finished was the kind of thing Abigail had been a teacher for approximately 2 weeks officially, and already knew she would remember for the rest of her life. I did it, Clara said with the wonder of someone who has just discovered something about themselves. You did it, Abigail confirmed. You've been doing it. You just needed enough practice to catch up to where you already were. Clara considered this philosophy seriously. Is that how everything works? Most things, Abigail said. It was a Tuesday. Nothing particular about it. Ordinary in the way that the best days often are unremarkable until you're looking back at them. Which was why she was entirely unprepared for what happened at noon. Harold Fitch came to the schoolhouse. He came with his hat in his hands. Again, she was starting to think of that as his honest posture, Harold Fitch with his hat in his hands. And he had someone with him she recognized, but hadn't spoken to directly in months. Agnes Whitmore, who was 81 years old, and had been in Silver Hollow longer than any building standing in it, who had sat in the Ladies' Aid Society for 50 years, and whose opinion carried more actual weight in this town than all 7 members of the church council combined. Agnes Whitmore did not come to people. People came to Agnes Whitmore. Abigail sent the children to the yard and stood in her schoolroom and looked at these 2 people and waited. Agnes wanted to come herself, Fitch said, which was his way of indicating this had not been his idea, and he was present only as transportation. Agnes Whitmore looked at Abigail with eyes that had seen more of life than most people would ever encounter and had developed the particular clarity that came from that much accumulated witness. Sit down, child, she said. You've been standing at attention since I walked in. Abigail sat. Agnes sat across from her without ceremony. I want to tell you something that I should have said 6 months ago and didn't, because I'm 81, and I've been letting Harold manage things he's not equipped to manage, and I got comfortable in my chair. She folded her hands. Thomas Mercer was a good man, a good pastor. He loved this town. But he did not own you. His death did not transfer ownership to the congregation. That is not how a person works, and it is not how faith works, and anyone who told you otherwise was confused about the nature of both. Abigail opened her mouth. I'm not finished, Agnes said in a tone that suggested she had learned the same trick Abigail had. You stood up in that meeting and said true things, uncomfortable things. Things this congregation needed to hear spoken plainly by someone they couldn't easily dismiss. A pause. I've been watching you for 14 months, Abigail, watching you hold yourself together while half this town used you for ballast. And I want you to know that what you did on Sunday, the courage of it, that was the most alive I've seen you since before Thomas died. The word alive landed directly on the exact place that had been tender longest. Agnes, her voice was not as steady as she'd have liked. The Ladies' Aid has voted, Agnes said. We want you at the school, properly, not as a volunteer, not on probation as the teacher. We've spoken to the school board. The funds are there. The position is yours as of September 1st if you want it. She looked at her steadily. Do you want it? Yes, Abigail said without hesitation. Yes. Agnes nodded once with the satisfaction of a woman who has done what needed doing. Then she looked at Fitch. Well, Fitch cleared his throat. He looked at Abigail with the expression of a man who had done his own accounting in the past week and not entirely liked the result. The council would like to formally withdraw the characterizations made in the letter, he said. The word unseemly was inappropriate, and I take responsibility for it. And the rest of it? Abigail asked. And the rest of it, he confirmed. All of it. She looked at him for a long moment. This man who had managed and pressured and constrained her for over a year with the perfect sincerity of someone who believed he was protecting rather than suffocating. She thought about whether she was angry. Checked. Found something more complex, tired, and also forgiving, and also clear-eyed about the fact that forgiveness and trust were not the same thing, and she was prepared to offer the first without immediately restoring the second. "I accept the apology, Harold," she said. "Genuinely." He exhaled. "Thomas would be—" "Let's leave Thomas out of this one," she said gently. "This is between you and me." He nodded, and something in him settled the way things settle when they've been held at tension for too long and someone finally gives permission to release. Agnes stood, looked at Abigail with those clear accumulated eyes. "One more thing," she paused. "The Cole man. What I've heard about him suggests a person of quality. I don't put much stock in church attendance as a measure of character. Never have, whatever Harold thinks." She glanced at Fitch, who had the grace to look only slightly affronted. "Silver Hollow could use more people who fix things without being asked." "I'll tell him you said so," Abigail said. "You do that." Agnes moved toward the door, then stopped with her hand on the frame. "You were always more than a symbol, Abigail. We just needed you to remind us." And she walked out. Fitch followed with a last nod that managed to carry both apology and dignity simultaneously, which Abigail gave him credit for. She sat alone in her schoolroom for a full minute. Then she went outside and found Jessie leaning against the fence, watching the children run the yard, with the particular quiet contentment of a man who has found a place he fits. "Agnes Whitmore came to see me," she said. He turned. "I know. I saw her carriage. She told me the teaching position is mine as of September." Something moved across his face, genuine, uncomplicated happiness on her behalf. "Abigail." And Fitch apologized. She paused. "Properly." "Good," Jessie said. "And Agnes said Silver Hollow could use more people who fix things without being asked." She looked at him. "She meant you." He was quiet a moment. Then, "That's a considerable endorsement. In this town, it's basically a coronation." That got the full smile. She let herself look at it as long as she wanted, which was longer than she once would have allowed herself. "Jessie," she said. "Yeah, I need to say something, and I'm going to say it before I think about it too much, because thinking about it too much is how I've been doing everything wrong for the past year." He turned to face her fully. "Okay, I love you," she said. "I'm telling you now because I know it and I have known it for a while, and the version of me that waited for things to be safer or tidier or more appropriate would have kept that sentence inside for another 6 months at least, and I am done being that version." He looked at her for a moment that was not long in clock time, and was very long in the way that things are long when they matter. "I love you," he said. "Have for a while. Was trying to let you get there in your own time." "I'm there," she said. "Yeah," he said. "I can see that." She stepped closer. "What now?" "Now we live," he said simply. "We teach and we fix things, and we figure it out day by day, and we stop waiting for permission from anyone to do that." She reached up and put her hand against his face. He covered it with his. They stood like that in the middle of the schoolyard in plain sight of anyone in Silver Hollow who cared to look, which she expected was most of them. She didn't look over her shoulder. Not once. Months move the way months do, when a life is actually being lived with a different rhythm than survival. Fuller and more uneven, and requiring constant presence. Abigail taught through the spring and into the summer, and by September the school board had formally posted the position, and she'd signed the papers with a hand that didn't shake at all. Pete stayed on as her unofficial deputy, his careful helpfulness slowly becoming something he no longer needed to pretend wasn't generosity. Clara read full paragraphs aloud to anyone who'd listen. 3 new children enrolled in the fall, including a pair of twins whose family had relocated from Billings, and Abigail found herself for the first time in a very long time looking forward to Monday mornings. Jessie built a small house on the edge of town. built it himself over the summer, with Pete helping on weekends and saying nothing about what it meant that he wanted to be involved. And Abigail brought food and stood at the frame and gave opinions about windows that Jesse mostly agreed with and occasionally debated. And the arguing about windows turned out to be one of her favorite things. He did not stop attending church. He did not start either. But he sat with Abigail one Sunday in October when the new pastor, a quiet man from Bozeman named Elias, who'd been Thomas's seminary friend, and who treated Abigail like a person from the first moment without being told, he should give a sermon about the difference between faith as performance and faith as root. And afterward, Jesse said it was the first sermon he'd heard in 4 years that felt like it was talking to him rather than at him. Abigail held that quietly for a long time. Thomas's grave was on the east side of the churchyard. She visited on the anniversary of his death, the way she had every year. But this time, she didn't go to perform grief or demonstrate fidelity, or give the congregation something to witness. She went because she had genuinely loved him, and he had genuinely been good. And the truth of a thing doesn't expire when new things begin. She stood there and talked to him low and honest, and she said what she'd needed to say for a long time, that she was going to be okay. That she was already more than okay, that she hoped, wherever he was, he could understand that love after loss wasn't replacement, it was continuation. That her heart hadn't been transferred to someone new. It had simply grown large enough for more than one chapter. She felt standing there, entirely at peace. On the first snow of November, Jesse found her standing outside the old abandoned church, the one where they'd sheltered from the storm, the one where the whole impossible thing had started, and he came up quietly behind her and said nothing for a while. Just stood there with her looking at the building that had witnessed the beginning of something neither of them had seen coming. "You regret any of it?" he asked. She thought about the past year, the 14 months of careful performance. The letter under the door, the meeting on Sunday, the walk down the road with her hand on his arm, and the whole town watching the schoolroom, and Clara's face reading a full sentence, and September's papers signed, and the house going up on the edge of town, and the conversations about windows that mattered more than they should. She thought about who she'd been when she arrived at this church, in a storm believing she had no choices left. She turned to face him. "I used to think my life ended when Thomas died," she said. "I thought everything after that was just maintenance, just getting through." She looked at him clearly, without reservation, without performance, without anything except the plain truth of who she was and what she knew. "You didn't save me, Jesse. I want to be clear about that. I saved myself, but you stood close enough that I remembered it was possible." He looked at her with those dark, steady eyes. "That's all I ever wanted to do." "I know," she said. "That's why it worked." She leaned up and kissed him there in the November cold beside the old church where everything had started, and the snow came down quiet, and even over Silver Hollow, and Abigail Mercer. Not the widow, not the symbol, not the decoration of anyone's grief, held the man she loved, and felt the full, unhurried weight of a life that was finally, completely, irrevocably her own. She had stopped surviving. She was living now, and she was never going back.